Welcome to the virtual public scoping meeting for the SpaceX Starship Super Heavy Cape Canaveral Space Force Station Environmental Impact Statement. This meeting will provide an opportunity for attendees to learn more about the proposed action and alternatives and provide an early and open process to assist the Department of the Air Force and its cooperating agencies in determining the scope of issues for analysis in the Environmental Impact Statement, including identifying significant environmental issues and eliminating from further study non-significant issues. The Department of the Air Force is the lead agency for this action. The Federal Aviation Administration, or FAA, is a cooperating agency, and the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, known as NASA, and U.S. Coast Guard were invited to be cooperating agencies for this action. The Department of the Air Force has issued a Notice of Intent, or NOI, to prepare an environmental impact statement, referred to as an EIS, to evaluate the potential environmental impacts associated with the execution of a real property agreement between the United States Space Force and Space Exploration Technologies Corporation, known as SpaceX, which would enable SpaceX to develop a launch site to support Starship Super Heavy operations, including launch and landing at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, and the FAA's issuance of a vehicle operator license at the selected launch site and approval of related airspace closures. The EIS will describe the affected environment, evaluate the potential impacts from the proposed action and alternatives, and propose mitigation to avoid, minimize, or reduce the potential for adverse impacts. This is a map of the proposed action area. The map includes the United States Space Force's Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, NASA's Kennedy Space Center, along with the Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge Complex and Canaveral National Seashore. The Department of the Air Force has identified a proposed action alternative, one reasonable action alternative, referred to as Alternative 1, and the no action alternative to be carried forward for analysis in the EIS. Under the proposed action, SpaceX would modify, reuse, or demolish the existing Space Launch Complex, SLIC 37, infrastructure at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station to support Starship Super Heavy launch and landing operations. A Space Launch Complex, or SLIC, is the launch pad and associated infrastructure for launching a rocket. Under Alternative 1, leasing SLIC 50 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, SpaceX would construct infrastructure to support Starship Super Heavy launch and landing operations on a site that is currently undeveloped. Under the no action alternative, U.S. Space Force would not enter into a real property agreement with SpaceX. SpaceX would not develop a launch and landing site in support of Starship Super Heavy launches, and SpaceX would not apply for an FAA vehicle operator license for Starship Super Heavy launches at either of the alternative SLICs under consideration. The National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, requires federal agencies to assess anticipated environmental impacts of their proposed actions, disclose their findings to the public, and solicit public input on their proposals. The first step in the NEPA process for preparing an EIS begins with the publication of a Notice of Intent to prepare an EIS in the Federal Register. The next step in the process is conducting a scoping period to identify issues that will be addressed in the EIS and solicit public input. We are currently in the public scoping period. Following the scoping period, a draft EIS is prepared, analyzing potential environmental impacts and proposing mitigation measures. After the preparation of the draft EIS, the Department of the Air Force and the cooperating agencies will solicit a public review and comment period to receive public feedback on the draft EIS. Next, a final EIS is prepared that addresses comments received on the draft EIS and identifies the agency's preferred alternative. The NEPA process concludes with the issuance of a record of decision, which identifies a selected alternative and outlines any mitigation measures if required. This slide shows the anticipated project timeline. On February 21, 2024, the Notice of Intent was published in the Federal Register. In March, multiple public scoping meetings were held in person and virtually. In spring 2024, environmental studies and evaluations will be conducted, and the draft EIS will be prepared. In December of 2024, the draft EIS will be published and a public hearing to receive your comments will be held. By summer of 2025, the Department of the Air Force will identify a preferred alternative and the final EIS will be published. The record of decision with the selected alternative will be issued in the summer of 2025, concluding the NEPA EIS process. The Notice of Availability, NOA, of the draft EIS is published in December 2024, and the NOA for the final EIS is anticipated in September 2025. A decision could be made no earlier than 30 days after the final EIS. The purpose of the action is to advance U.S. space capabilities and provide launch and landing infrastructure in furtherance of U.S. policy to ensure capabilities necessary to launch and insert Department of the Air Force payloads into space, fulfilling the national security policy outlined in 10 U.S. Code Section 2273. The need for the action is to ensure Department of the Air Force assured access to space without compromising current launch capabilities and fulfill in part the U.S. Congress's grant of authority to the Secretary of Defense pursuant to 10 U.S. Code Section 2276A, Commercial Space Launch Cooperation, that the Secretary of Defense is permitted to take action to maximize the use of the Department of Defense space transportation infrastructure by the private sector in the U.S., maximize the effectiveness and efficiency of the space transportation infrastructure of the DoD, reduce the cost of services provided by the DoD related to space transportation infrastructure at launch support facilities and space recovery support facilities, encourage commercial space activities by enabling investment by covered entities in the space transportation infrastructure of the DoD, foster cooperation between the DoD and covered entities. The resources to be analyzed in the EIS include airspace and maritime resources, air quality, climate change, noise, cultural resources, biological resources, water resources, hazardous materials and wastes, land use, infrastructure and utilities, geology, socioeconomics, environmental justice, safety and occupational health, and Section 4F resources, which can include publicly owned public parks, recreation areas, and wildlife and waterfowl refuges, as well as significant historic sites. Please note that the map image on this slide shows the launch azimuth limits for Starship Super Heavy. An azimuth is a horizontal direction expressed as the angular distance between the direction of a fixed point and the direction of the launch vehicle. Cooperating agencies have jurisdiction by law or special expertise in potential environmental impacts from the proposed action. They assist the lead federal agency in preparing the EIS. The Department of the Air Force is the lead agency for this EIS. They are the lead agency because the action would occur on Department of Air Force property managed by the U.S. Space Force and would require a real property agreement between U.S. Space Force and SpaceX. The FAA is a cooperating agency, and NASA and U.S. Coast Guard are cooperating agencies for this action. The FAA's action is to issue a vehicle operator license to SpaceX for Starship Super Heavy for non-DoD operations at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. The FAA must also approve related airspace closures for launch and landing operations. NASA has special expertise with respect to potential environmental impacts from space launch and the operation of launch sites. The U.S. Coast Guard has regulatory authority over waters subject to jurisdiction of the U.S. They evaluate launch and reentry activities for potential risks to the maritime transportation system and support early warning communications to the maritime industry. Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act is a consultation process that requires federal agencies to identify and resolve any adverse effects that a proposed action may have on historic properties. Section 106 consultation involves the agency and the State Historic Preservation Officer, SHPO, if the proposed action has potential to adversely affect a national historic landmark. Then the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation is also required to participate. Consulting parties are individuals and organizations that have an interest in the proposed action and may be affected by its potential impacts to historic properties. Consulting parties can include Native American tribes, local governments, neighborhood associations, preservation organizations, and individuals. Consulting parties have the right to be informed about proposed undertakings, to review and comment on Section 106 documentation, and to participate in consultation meetings. They can also request a meeting with the federal agency to discuss concerns. Federal agencies are required to consider the views of consulting parties throughout the Section 106 process. If you wish to be a consulting party, please state your request to be a consulting party in the same way you would submit a comment. If you would like to submit your request to be a consulting party after the scoping comment period has closed, please do so via email, mail, or the project website. There are multiple ways to submit your comments. These include submitting electronically via the electronic comment form, which can be accessed via QR code on the screen or by link placed in the chat. Type your comment into the chat. Email your comment to contactus@spaceforcestarship.eis.com. Mail your comment to CCSFS Starship EIS, care of Jacobs, at 5401 West Kennedy Boulevard, number 300, Tampa, Florida 33609. Visit the project website to submit an electronic comment form. The site is www.spaceforcestarship.eis.com. Please note that your comments will help determine the scope of the EIS so that relevant issues and potential impacts are analyzed in the EIS. Comments are given the same consideration regardless of how they are submitted. To ensure the Department of the Air Force has sufficient time to consider public input in the draft EIS, please submit your comments by March 22, 2024. All comments will be made public. Questions regarding the scoping comment period can be directed to contactus@spaceforcestarship.eis.com. Thank you for attending this virtual public scoping meeting for the SpaceX Starship Super Heavy Cape Canaveral Space Force Station Environmental Impact Statement.